You off with chapter 2, and chapter 2 is a little bit larger and more in detail than chapter 1, so there's going to be 3 video installments for chapter 2. And this first one will specifically be looking at 2.1 functions and evolution of human resource management, which is a large chunk of this chapter, and then 2.2 organisational structure. Then video number 2 of chapter 2 will cover leadership and management and motivation, and the final instalment for chapter 2 will cover corporate culture and employee relations. Again, all notes and extracts are taken directly from our Paul Hoang 3rd edition textbook, so refer there for looking at things in a little bit more detail. Pause as you go if you want to take notes and so on and so forth, but this should take about 30 minutes to run through the sections of 2.1 and 2.2 in summary. So starting with the functions and evolutions of human resource management, we need to define human resource management. Human resource management, which is often shortened to HRM or just HR for human resources, is the management function of using and developing people within a business to meet organisational objectives. So realistically speaking, this is anything to do with your employees, okay? So everything to do with figuring out what employees we need, okay? That's known as workforce planning, to the recruitment, selection and induction of them, training of them, performance management and appraisals, reviewing pay and remuneration, disciplinary and grievance procedures, and looking after their welfare. So human resources deals with all elements of the employee process, shall we say. So if we look at these key terms, most of these are pretty self-explanatory. When we talk about performance management and staff appraisals, we're talking about the reviews of staff performance. So usually on an annual basis, staff will be appraised for how well they're meeting targets and are they fulfilling the requirements of their job description. And then when we talk about reviewing pay and remuneration, we're talking about where a salary package is not just a financial amount, but that salary package might include additional benefits, a company car or health insurance, or your package might include your child's education at an international school or something like that. That means that you receive a remuneration package. So remuneration being the whole package that employees receive in exchange for the work that they do. The vast majority of that, of course, is their salary, but most people receive their salary and other stuff as well. Disciplinary and grievance, so making complaints, where staff can make complaints about other staff or about school policies or work policies, and disciplinary, where we can challenge members of staff on their behaviour in relation to what they should be doing. So these are the functions and evolutions of the human resource process. And if we start by considering what labour turnover is, okay? So essentially, businesses have to recruit employees for 2 reasons. Either the business is growing, launching a new product, a new range, opening a new store, or developing its systems to increase output, and therefore it needs to hire new people. This is one reason for recruitment. The second reason for recruitment is because we need to replace staff that are leaving. So labour turnover is the measure of the percentage of the workforce that leaves an organisation in any given time period, usually 1 year. So your labour turnover might be replacing people who are retiring or people who've been fired. It could be about replacing people who have chosen to leave. And people choose to leave for different reasons. And that's important as well. So labour turnover itself is a calculation. It looks at the number of staff who are leaving as a proportion of the total number of staff. So number of staff leaving divided by total number of staff times 100 gives you a percentage of labour turnover in a year. The reason it's important for businesses to understand the scale of their labour turnover, as well as the reasons for why staff are leaving, is that this can actually be an indicator to employee satisfaction, and it can also be an indicator towards motivation and leadership styles and how employees respond and react to leadership styles. And this is important because the whole recruitment process, the whole advertising and shortlisting and appointing and then training people, that whole process is hugely expensive to businesses. So businesses want to try and reduce their labour turnover. It's not good to have a huge labour turnover, mainly because not only is it very expensive, but then you don't have the consistency and you're losing your experienced staff. So businesses need to understand their labour turnover. They need to understand the reasons for their labour turnover. So it's important that businesses go through the process of collecting data from their staff who are leaving as to the reasons why they're leaving. And if those reasons are within the control of the company, businesses potentially need to look at ways in which to manage that. And that might be about motivational theory. It might be about remuneration packages. It could be about leadership style. It could be about a variety of different things. But understanding the reasons for why people leave is still key to businesses reducing staff wanting to leave. So this talks about labour turnover. It is important to note that, bringing in new staff is a good thing for businesses as well. Businesses want to have fresh ideas and people coming from different perspectives and different strengths, people who have come through recently trained courses through university that have got a different perspective. This is, good for businesses in innovation and adaptivity and creativity and in enabling businesses to move in a changing world. But it has to be a balance. If businesses have a huge staff turnover, 30, 40, 50% staff turnover in a year, then we're not guaranteeing the kind of consistency that we want for our customers, and we're not ensuring that the money that we're investing in staff training is actually, worth it in the long run. So this looks at labour turnover. We also have to consider the external factors that impact on recruitment. And these external factors that impact on recruitment are separated into three areas. We have the demographics, the sort of statistical data we have on the available population. We've got labour mobility, which can be separated by geographical and occupational, and we have changing technologies. And these factors are also impacting who businesses can recruit and when they can recruit them and who they need and in what types of jobs. So demographics might talk about things like the net birth rate or the retirement age. It might talk about things like the availability of people from certain qualification backgrounds, and it might talk about migration statistics. And all of these factors are going to impact the availability of the workforce to businesses. Demographics means that depending upon who's available as the workforce, this is the likelihood of who we're going to be able to recruit. So as demographics change in different places, this is going to impact who businesses can bring on as part of their human resources. In labour mobility, we talk about geographical and occupational. Geographical labour mobility means physically moving location to take on a new job. I'm British, I'm not from France, but I work in Monaco and live in France. I have labour mobility, a geographical labour mobility, because I've physically moved to take on that work. Being occupationally mobile means that you don't necessarily need to physically move location, but you need to be able to retrain and be flexible about changing your job and about changing your skill set and maybe moving into different sectors of work as changing environments and as changing technology and changing demand requires you to do so. So when we think about the factors that impact on labour mobility, we might be talking about the fact that an ageing population is going to be less mobile and less willing, usually, to retrain and take on occupational mobility. And there's a significant fear of the unknown associated with both geographical and occupational labour mobility. We don't know, what to expect. The culture's going to be different, the language will be different, or we don't know that we're going to be successful in this role, and that it's going to be something that we're going to enjoy. And there's a lot of cost associated as well, because people have to think about relocation costs, cost of living, etc., associated with geographical, and for occupational, the cost of training is going to impact people's decision to be mobile. And so this is going to impact how available these kind of flexible workforces are for businesses that are recruiting people. So when we think about, as I said, the reasons for recruitment, either replacing people or hiring new people, well, depending upon where my business is and what I want to be able to, what kind of workers I need, all of these factors are going to impact that. The demographics of my local area, the labour mobility, whether that is people moving to the area to work, looking at the occupational mobility of people who are here, maybe that I need to retrain and reskill in order to take on new roles. This is going to change who I can recruit and in what roles. The same with changing technologies. Changing technologies, especially communication technologies, have enabled more people to take on roles in flexible working structures, things like flexi time, working from home, using things like video conferencing and Skype and emails, using things like cloud storage to share files with colleagues, has changed the kinds of employees that perhaps we need. So we have more teleworkers, people working from home. We have more part-time workers, more flexi-time workers, more portfolio workers. And the advancements in these kinds of technologies have enabled those different working patterns, the employment patterns, to move around. And this is, it feeds into a theory called Handy's Shamrock. Charles Handy's the theorist. You'll find that in the in the textbook under this chapter, Handy's Shamrock. And Handy's Shamrock talks about how businesses need to have a good variety of 3 types of employees in order to be flexible to meet customer demand. Full-time employees, part-time and flexible time employees, and subcontracted or external employees to sort of counterbalance the demands made by customers. And so this comes very much under how our changing technologies and our improving communication technologies have made this possible for businesses, and therefore enabling businesses to be more flexible in who they hire and for what roles. So we have to consider these factors impacting workforce planning when businesses are recruiting. Businesses also have to think about where they're going to advertise jobs. And sort of if we separate these headings out and we look at the first one as separate, internal recruitment, that means to promote from within. And promoting from within is very beneficial when we are looking for somebody who we absolutely trust, to take on a job that requires sort of a knowledge of the policies and procedures and cultures of the organisation. Internal recruitment means obviously promoting, meaning, yeah, we know this person and we know and we're confident that they could do the job. It doesn't completely remove the need for bringing in somebody external, because obviously further down the chain, if everybody moves a step up in responsibility, you need to bring somebody in at the ground level. But that level of recruitment might be considered less risky because you're only bringing somebody in, for a ground level member of staff, for a base level member of staff, whereas the higher position has been filled by somebody who has already built the trust of the company. So with internal recruitment, this reduces costs because we don't have to spend anywhere near as much money in advertising and shortlisting and interviewing and relocation costs and all of this kind of thing. But it does reduce the potential range of applicants. So if we're looking for somebody with really specific skills, if we're only going to advertise internally, we're really going to restrict the potential candidates for the role. If we choose to recruit externally, so looking at bringing in fresh ideas and and somebody from outside the organisation, somebody maybe who's had experience working in other organisations, then usually businesses will have to decide their method of advertisement. And a lot of this will depend upon the type of skill that the company is looking to recruit. You know, if you're looking for a fairly low-skilled role, menial labour element role, some kinds of service industry, you know, waiters and waitresses, hotel staff, retail staff, etc. Realistically speaking, you're going to advertise locally. And so you have local newspapers, and you know, you might have local job centres that advertise these kinds of roles. There'll be internet sites that provide local services for job advertisement. But then you also have the national and the international levels of these systems as well. So obviously, to advertise in a national newspaper or an international newspaper, it's going to be more expensive than advertising in a local one, but you're going to get different kinds of applicants. Specialist trade publications are whereby you have either a website or a magazine that is dedicated to that specific role, that specific function, that specific skill. So there are websites that are just dedicated to advertising jobs for teaching. There are websites that are dedicated to just advertising jobs for managers of retail outlets. Okay, there are websites just dedicated to advertising jobs for people who work in fashion or people who work in journalism. These obviously attract people of that group to view the potential roles. The internet's huge in this. Obviously, you've got newspapers that are online. A lot of specialist trade publications will also be online. And you also have just job search engines that companies will pay to be part of online. Employment agencies are interesting. And this is often the case used when businesses have a large number of recruitments to make and a large number of roles to fill, because the recruitment process takes a long time. As I was mentioning, you know, you have to look through all of these CVs and application forms and decide who's relevant. Well, employment agencies are great because they're very expensive, but they kind of do the shortlisting for you. So they'll post the ad, they'll collect in all the CVs, they might even do the criminal records checks for you, but they will compare each CV alongside your personal specification, what you said the people should be able to do, you know, their skills and qualifications, and they will shortlist for you and provide you with a list of the recommended best candidates from those that have applied. But this is a very expensive option, so a lot of businesses can't really look to this option. Job centres are available. There's many countries that have job centres as an option. And what job centres tend to do is more local facilities where local businesses can advertise, and people who are unemployed can attend job centres, and there are staff to support them in identifying the best roles to meet their skills and support them in the application process and training for how to sit interviews and things like this. So it's a service that's often provided under the funding of government in order to try and reduce unemployment. Headhunting. This is whereby businesses who are looking for a really specialist skill will, instead of advertising, will approach an employee of another organisation who fulfills that role for that other organisation and try and lure them away, try and steal them away from that other company by offering them a better package, more money or better remuneration packages. So it's quite common in sports industry, in football. You know, this happens all the time with agents and different football clubs. But it'll also happen in high-end tech industry when you've got people who are designing and working in code in areas of Silicon Valley where their role is specifically specialised. And so advertising wouldn't necessarily draw the kinds of applications that they would want, so they go and try and steal somebody away from somewhere else. And lastly, we have employee referrals, where perhaps we're not actually going to advertise itself, but somebody who has worked with somebody else before says, I know somebody who would be great for that job, And this is beneficial in some ways because you have the kind of trust associated, well, somebody else, knows them at least. But you do also have the risk of developing, sort of favoritism within the workforce, and these cliques that can cause conflict if there are other groups that feel that treatment has been unfair to one individual rather than the other. So this looks at where to advertise, but what about the actual steps in the recruitment process? Well, there are 10 steps of recruitment and selection, and those 10 steps have to start with a job analysis to actually identify what the business's needs are. And this job analysis might be analysing the job of somebody who's leaving to see whether or not their role has adapted and evolved since they started, as jobs often do because of technology and changing market needs. Or obviously sometimes when businesses need to recruit for the purpose of the business growing, an analysis looking at exactly what needs we have, how many people we need to fill jobs, what hours they will need, what skill sets they'll need, and who we need to fill this job. This job analysis fills nicely into the role of then producing what we call the job description and the person specification. Job description is the document that outlines all of the roles that the candidate would be expected to complete, the actual description of the job. So it's a description, for example, a maths teacher's job description might say to teach maths at IGCSE and to teach maths at IB, to plan and deliver curriculum, to report to parents, to mark and feedback on student work, etc. This is a description of all the jobs and the roles and responsibilities they're expected to complete. And you have a different document called the person specification. Sometimes you see it called the job specification, but the person specification should outline the qualities, the qualifications, and the characteristics that the right candidate will have. So in my same example of the maths job, the maths teacher, the person specification might say that they should have a degree in maths, that they should have at least 2 years experience teaching, that they should have attended a recent IB training course, that they should be honest and responsible, that they should be creative and innovative. These are characteristics, and these are qualifications, and these are requirements of experience that describe the right candidate. So there is a difference between a job description and a person specification, but the company must produce both. Once you've produced your job description and personal specification, you advertise the vacant post wherever you have chosen to advertise. It might be in a newspaper, might be on a website, might be at a job centre, might be going to a university fair and trying to attract young graduates. Wherever I'm advertising, I'm starting to advertise. And so people start to apply. And these applications come in the form of usually an application form or a CV, which stands for curriculum vitae. So we're going to check through these applications, and what the company has to do is it has to usually literally use the personal specification as a checklist. Go through the CV and say, do they have this? Do they have that? So in my personal specification, I said, should have a maths degree. Do they have a maths degree? Tick. Then they can go on to the next question. If they don't, throw them out. Throw the pile into the no pile straight away. And this helps to shortlist suitable candidates. You're identifying whether the candidates actually meet the requirements that you identified in your job analysis. So this is the process of shortlisting. Once you get to a reasonable list of shortlisted candidates, you're going to conduct some interviews. And we're going to try and identify the personal characteristics that can't be conveyed in a letter or a CV. So maybe their communication skills. We're going to ask them questions about why they want to work for us, for our company. We get a better sense of their character and of how they interact with other people during this interview. We may choose to perform aptitude testing. So when we choose to test people, we've got aptitude testing and we've got behavioural testing. So aptitude might be about specific skill sets. If we're hiring somebody as an accountant, we might want them to complete a financial analysis task where they have to produce a balance sheet, or they have to do some profitability ratios in a very quick period of time, or against the clock, or perhaps against other people. Behavioural testing might be where we put them in a customer situation. We actually see how they behave under pressure or under stress. So maybe we want to perform some testing. This could be part of the interview process to see what we think. We're going to check references, so we're going to contact previous employers or previous teachers in some cases, or their university references, to ask for a reference stating, whether or not this person would be suitable for the role. And then we want to make a job offer to the best candidate, and we hope that the best candidate will accept our job offer. So we're going to have to put some money on the table at this point. We're going to have to say how much we want to offer them, and the actual contract will be reviewed at this stage, what we are asking them to sign up to. And if they're happy, then they're going to sign the contract of employment. And officially at this point, they become our employee, and so it's time to start carrying out the induction of the new recruit. So this is the first steps of training, bringing them in and introducing them into the company's policies and procedures, the physical layout of the company, where things are, fire and escapes and so on and so forth, things like that. How specific systems work, like logging onto the computers, or how the process works in requesting absence and all of that kind of stuff that employees need to know, that will be different for every company. This is part of the induction process. So these are the 10 steps to carrying out recruitment and selection. Training and appraisal would come next after we've actually recruited our staff. We have to ensure that staff are well trained. This again links back into motivation theory. So we have to be aware that obviously the higher trained our staff are, usually the better quality the work they produce is. And so that has to be considered. And staff feel that when they are invested in, when they're provided the opportunities for training, that they are being valued. And so it is a motivational opportunity as well. All goes in that idea of Pink's autonomy, mastery and purpose, giving people the opportunity to master something, or Maslow's self-esteem needs. So training is the process of providing opportunities for workers to acquire employment-related skills and knowledge. You have on-the-job training and off-the-job training. So, for example, your induction, learning all the roles and processes, might be on the job, where you actually sort of get teamed up with somebody who knows what they're doing, and you maybe follow them around for a week. You shadow them. You see how they do things. You buddy up and do some training on the job whilst you're still productive in the office. Off-the-job training is usually more specialist, where you have to leave site to go and do some training that that the company themselves can't really provide. Maybe first aid training or health and safety training or something like that, where you have to go to a more specialist provider. Often more expensive off the job training, and obviously a greater distraction in the sense that you're genuinely not on site, and you may have to pay somebody to replace that person for the time that they're away. But you might say that this is more productive in the long run because they get more specialist training. But both have functions in different ways. And we have cognitive and behavioural training, so training based upon skills, based upon improving skill sets, improving speed and ability. And behavioural training might be things like looking at well-being of staff, or looking at global citizenship and how people behave in certain situations. Maybe looking at team building skills and communication skills. This could be behavioural. The appraisal process, as part of training here, is when we actually assess employees' performance in relation to their job description. So when we appraise employees, this often is linked to training in the sense that if we go in and we visit a member of staff when they're working and we identify some things that they're not doing very well or some areas that they need to improve, we set some targets. It is the responsibility of the organisation, of the company, to ensure that that employee has the training needed in order to achieve those targets. We can't just turn up to appraisals and say, we expect staff to do X, Y, and Z, but then not support them in how to achieve that. There are different types of appraisals: formative, summative, 360, and self-appraisal. So formative appraisal is sort of the ongoing conversations happening between supervisors and employees. This gives people the chance to improve, whereas summative is kind of a final, at this date, looking back over what we've done in the last year. So employees may have a combination of both of this. You may have a date for a summative appraisal, your big main date, think of it like a final exam. But the formative, think of it as your ongoing lessons, where you can learn as you go. You can still ask questions. You still get feedback, but that's all in the run up to this sort of end point. 360-degree appraisals is where we get feedback from everyone, not just the managers. So because it's 360 degree, like a circle. So we look at the colleagues, we look at subordinates, we look at other managers. Anyone who you work with can give feedback on your performance in a 360-degree appraisal. So it's very time consuming, but it gives you really quality data. Obviously there's a risk that some individuals, especially subordinates, may use it as an attack on managers. That's not necessarily truthful, but it is possible. And self-appraisal is where before you go into a formative or summative review, you have to actually look at your own performance and you have to identify what you do well and set some targets for yourself. And this is quite a reflective process of appraisal as well. Appraisal should also be used to guide companies on pay, and if there's going to be the potential for pay rise or bonuses, or if there's going to be the potential for promotion, or if there's going to be the potential for disciplinary action for staff that are not meeting targets, and even though training is put in place, are failing to achieve, we can use appraisals and the documented evidence from appraisals to follow that process as well. So this takes us on to the idea of dismissal and redundancy. It's very important that you know that there is a difference between being dismissed, okay, which people often call being fired or being sacked, and being made redundant, okay? Being made redundant is not being fired. It is not being sacked. So please do not ever say redundancy is when you get fired, but it's not your fault. That's not true, okay? Redundancy is not being fired. Redundancy is, the only similarity is that both times employees lose their jobs. In a dismissal, otherwise known as being fired or sacked, the company decides to terminate the worker's employment due to their incompetence, so an unsatisfactory performance or a breach of contract. This leads back into what I said before about appraisal. Appraisal gives the company the evidence, the ongoing evidence, used to, if necessary, make a dismissal happen. Redundancies, also known as retrenchments or layoffs, these happen when businesses can no longer afford to employ workers or when the job ceases to exist. Okay, so the employee is not being fired, but they are losing their jobs because the job doesn't exist anymore. They've not done anything wrong in this sense. General Motors have just announced the closure of 6 plants in North America. This is redundancies. Those employees have done nothing wrong, but 6,000 of them are about to be laid off, lose their jobs, as a result of the fact that the company cannot afford to keep those plants running. Businesses will often ask for voluntary redundancies first. This is often people who are close to retirement who don't mind saying, yeah, okay, I'll take a redundancy because actually it means I get a payout at this stage, and it's not going to make a significant difference. Other people who might take voluntary redundancy are people who maybe aren't particularly happy in the job and maybe are looking for a change of career, wanting to be occupationally mobile and retrain or reskill. So companies will often ask for voluntary redundancies first, but then if they don't get enough, they'll have to force compulsory redundancies, which is when often businesses will get some sort of negative media in the press because it's seen as something that's quite unethical and immoral in a lot of ways. Although it is a necessary part of business if businesses can't afford to keep those roles going. Important also to note with the redundancies that people who are made redundant receive a payment. It's called redundancy pay. It is based upon the number of years that you have worked for the company. So usually it's between 1 and 2 weeks of salary or wage for every year worked. Depending upon your contract, it might be more or less. Some businesses will go up as far as a month of redundancy pay for every year worked. Whereas, obviously, if you've only worked for a company for a couple of years, then your redundancy pay is not going to be a significant amount of money. So this takes us into the sort of last section talking about human resource planning before we look at organisational structure. Outsourcing, offshoring and reshoring. Now this comes under human resource planning because it thinks about where our work comes from. Outsourcing is this idea of getting other companies to do parts of our jobs for us. Okay, it's usually parts of the job that are not integral to what we do, but they are still internal roles. The external company is known as a subcontractor. So we might get our IT functions outsourced to a subcontracting company. So we no longer have to pay an IT department to manage our IT systems. We get a specialist company who specialises in managing networks and so on and so forth to take care of it. So perhaps we get a better quality provision. But at the same time, because they're not internal to our company, we don't have full control over how they behave. Maybe their culture and their values doesn't necessarily match our company's culture and values, and we may not be a priority to them as an organisation. So advantages and disadvantages to outsourcing. Offshoring is usually an extension of outsourcing, although you can offshore your own organisation, but quite often offshoring and outsourcing go hand in hand. Offshoring is where businesses actually relocate part of the business activities abroad, and it's usually to reduce costs because of lower production costs, lower taxes, etc. And it can be that the company itself will employ their own factory workers, their own employees in an offshore factory, but it's more often the case that they will offshore and outsource to another organisation that already does that. So offshoring is often about reducing costs, but more commonly in recent years we see reshoring occurring. And reshoring is the reversal of the offshoring process, where we actually bring employees, where we bring business functions back to the host country, the country of origin of the company. And this is for various reasons, possibly because the cost benefits of moving to places like China and India are less significant now than they were 10 years ago, because those countries are at a stage of development now where their costs are increasing. So it's actually not significantly beneficial anymore, although there are new emerging developing nations like Brazil, for example, that would potentially be a better option for offshoring to. The other reason for reshoring is because there's sort of this social trend towards a patriotic or a nationalist movement of where products are made. This sort of made in France, made in the UK, made in America kind of mentality. And this is politically driven, but it is changing the habits of purchasers, of customers. And customers who look to locally produce products will often choose to support businesses who invest in their own local economy. So that's another reason for reshoring. So again, all to do with how we manage our human resources. Do we get other companies to do it for us? Do we move abroad in order to reduce costs? Do we bring it back in order to better improve our image? And the last section of this two elements of chapter 2 is talking about organisational structure. The organisational structure of the company literally talks about the hierarchy of the company, who reports to whom. You've got two examples here. This is a relatively wide span of control organisation, what we would call a flat organisation. And this is an organisation with a narrow span of control, what we would call a tall organisation. So different terms that we want to look at here. Accountability and responsibility. Accountability and responsibility says, who am I accountable to and who am I responsible for? Okay, so this person here in the hierarchy is accountable to the manager, the CEO up here. But he is responsible for the people beneath him in the hierarchy. They are accountable to him. So to be accountable to somebody is who you report to, the person above you in the chain of command, whereas you are responsible for the people below you in the chain of command. Then we talk about delegation. Delegation is where managers share parts of their responsibilities with people below them in the organisation. Delegation often happens more in flat organisations like so, where you have a lot more employees and less managers, so they can't do everything, and they also can't supervise and watch everybody at all times. So sometimes they look for trusted employees and they delegate roles to them. This doesn't put that employee higher in the chain, it just gives them more responsibility. And that additional responsibility might benefit them in future if they're to apply for a promotion or if they're to apply somewhere else. The span of control talks about how many employees each manager or supervisor is responsible for. Okay, so in this organisation there is a very wide span of control. They have a lot of employees that sit underneath the role of these two managers. Whereas in this organisation, there's a very narrow span of control. You have less individuals who are directly accountable to you, who you are directly responsible for. We talk about the chain of command. The chain of command refers to the appropriate line of communication through the organisation. If this employee at the bottom has a problem, it's not really appropriate for them to go straight to this guy. It's appropriate for them to go through their line manager, through the person that they are accountable to, and that person, if they can't deal with it, they will then go to their line manager, and so on and so forth. This is called the chain of command. It is the line of communication, the appropriate line of communication without skipping levels that a hierarchy provides. Bureaucracy. This talks about sort of the paperwork and the delays in decision making. Bureaucratic organisations tend to be the taller organisations where you've got more layers of management, and so potentially more controls, more paperwork, more decision making. Whereas in a flatter organisation, decisions might be quicker, but these individuals down here may feel that their voices are less heard because there's 15 or so of them here, and they're not all going to be able to communicate directly to their managers. Whereas of course in this kind of an organisation where you have very small teams and small numbers of workers reporting to supervisors, those smaller teams are more easily communicated to. So bureaucracy thinks about sort of the Chinese whispers effect of the delay of communication, the problems associated with diseconomies of scale as the company gets taller. Delayering is the process of removing layers in order to reduce bureaucracy. So some businesses will get to the stage where they find actually we don't need this layer anymore, we're going to take it out. And we're just, these 4 people will all report directly to him. So maybe this means making people redundant, maybe it means waiting until people retire and then just not replacing them. But delayering is often a process that businesses will go through when they want to sort of flatten their organisational structure, helping communication to flow. And then we have the idea of centralisation and decentralisation. This talks about whether decision making happens in the centre of the organisation and just sort of gets devolved out and the message gets passed on, or whether decision making can actually happen at a lower level, away from the centre of the organisation. So narrow span of control in a tall organisation tends to have more decentralisation because these supervisors and sort of sub-managers will often have more control to make decisions within the organisation. So you might believe that they have a more democratic system, a more democratic leadership style, perhaps more autonomy, according to Pink, in a decentralised organisation where people closer to the ground, closer to the customer, are going to be able to make certain decisions. Whereas in that centralised idea, you have a small, close-knit group of decision makers in the centre of an organisation. You might call them the autocrats, perhaps, making decisions and simply disseminating that information out to the masses. And that person might be quite removed from the actual work that is done or from the actual end-level customer. So these are organisational structures, and obviously you'll have very different varieties of these depending upon which business you're looking at. It's not to say that one is good and one is bad. They provide different benefits and drawbacks to different types of organisations. Okay, so that summarises 2.1 and 2.2, and the next video will cover 2.3 and 2.4, which is leadership style and motivation.